Hello and welcome to the Homespun History Podcast with me, Anne Harper.
And me, Dr. Gavin Hughes.
Join us as we attempt to weave history and music together to tell the stories of the people, the places and the landscapes that we love.
Well, Gavin, where are we today?
Well, Anne, today we're at Goward Dolmen, just outside Hilltown. Beautiful, beautiful summer, sunny morning.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
It is.
Just coming into this little dell that surrounds the dolmen.
That's a great way of describing this.
Isn't it lovely? Sort of tree surrounded little. It reminds me of like a Shakespearean sort of dell, what I would imagine a dell to be like. And we've got lots of hawthorn trees and they're just starting to, the berries are coming out. And it's a beautiful, gorgeous morning.
It is. If you can imagine, first of all, imagine the green rolling drumlins of County Down, but imagine a small single carriageway road.
Yes, a little track.
Yeah. That ends in a tiny little kind of car park, opposite which you've got a small, ancient, big stone wall which goes into a dip, and it's bounded by an ancient hedge on two sides with a very old
this is a beautiful old ash tree. We're standing beside, but I absolutely love this tree because it's the perfect place to sit and have a picnic, and it just sort of really is the most, I don't know, it creates a beautiful atmosphere, that tree standing. I don't know how old it would be. It's quite substantial anyway.
Do you know, I would suspect it's at least a couple of 100 years old.
Could be.
And I sort of say that because I kind of feel that also in this little kind of like enclosure we've got here, we have the dolmen off to our left. We'll chat about that in a bit. Mm-hmm. But we also have the ruins of a small house here, a small house from the 19th century, which reputedly belonged to a fellow called Pat Kearney. And we don't know a whole lot about
Pat Kearney, except that he gave his name to, this dolmen in this part of the world, even now.
That's known as Pat Kearney's
Big
Stone.
So he lived, the remains of his house that were just in front of us now, and the dolmen to our left. I mean, he really was living right beside the dolmen.
He was, and we don't know whether he was actually living. In fact, actually, we're looking at the remains of his little cabin here.
We're on a slope, though. This is what sort of amazes me about his house. It is on a bit of a slope.
The weird thing is, if you were going to build your little house beside the dolmen,
why here?
Why here? You'd build it further on the top of the hill. As Anne says, we're actually on the slope. This hedge wouldn't have been here. No,
I've got some photographs actually of this site taken at various points in time. And in the first picture that we're looking at, you can see well behind the dolmen. So if we position ourselves in the same place and look at the dolmen, we actually can't see any of the landscape behind today because it's all lovely trees, mostly ash trees here. But at some point in the past, when perhaps the local people were using more wood to heat their homes, the trees weren't as substantial around here, and you could actually see much further. And so in this picture that I'm just showing Gavin now, you can see the town of Rathfriland over to the left.
I'm just having a look at that, Anne, and what strikes me is how open it is.
The landscape so it's certainly changed. There's more trees now than there would have been, and I've heard people, say that was probably because trees, were very often cut down to heat your home with. So, and I've got one here, which is a slightly different angle, and you can see Knock Ivy.
Yes, you can in the distance.
So, depending on which angle you take, you can see various other features in the landscape: the town of Rathfriland, the town of Hilltown, and also, importantly, in my view anyway, the hill of Knock Ivy in the background. And here's a lovely picture from the Larne Times in 1910.
The Larne Times is always very good.
It's actually the other angle, looking back from behind this amazingly huge dolmen, which I'll have to describe to you in a second, or maybe you could do that, Gavin. But it's interesting, it talks about the name of Goward, where we're standing, and it translates it, Goward, which is Guhard, meaning high voice from the echo.
High voice from the echo.
Which I think, as a musician, that's a fabulous name for a place, high voice from the echo. So I'm wondering what echoes we're getting here. Are there echoes within the landscape, and what kind of an echo would you have got? And that's the kind of picture that it paints in my mind and the questions that I ask. high voice.
It does suggest that they would somebody somewhere, at least at some point.
A resounding place.
A resounding
place.
place.
Resounding. Yeah. So that was and I've seen other translations of Goward as well that weren't quite so maybe Victorian and flowery as that one in the Lauren Times, but high voice from the echo. So we're about 2 miles out of Hilltown, and what are we looking at when we're standing watching this dolmen? Let's paint a picture in your minds of what we're looking at.
Well, it's a classic dolmen. The big stone, as we say, Pat Kearney's big stone, I think it's about 50 tons.
50 tons.
50 tons. It's a huge, huge stone. And if we go up to it, it actually has fallen over. It should have been horizontal. It's a passage tomb, really, where the kind of...
And actually, at one point in time, it was standing, I believe, on 2 other stones at the back.
Yes, and we can see...
So it wasn't sort of leaning against the ground and shored
as
up
it is now. So
it's
it's almost like a tripod.
I've got a lovely picture here of a little boy sitting in front of the stone just where we're standing
yes,
here.
in 1910.
And he obviously putting perspective on this huge, huge stone, which is probably 5 foot, 4 foot deep, and I think 10 foot long, something like that. And it's made of granite, as are all these stones.
Everything in this region is pretty much granite. I'm just looking. You can see like sort of the massive. Somebody referred to it like a beached whale. With barnacles on it, and that's actually, yes.
Yeah, because the lichen is growing on it in little circles, as you would expect, and that's a good sign, really, that we've got lichen growing here.
And there are 2, let's say 2 uprights, at least 3 maybe, and just go around the other side. 2 major uprights, and a tinier upright, which are basically keeping the big stone, the keystone, if you like, in place from falling.
And it really is vast, and when you stand underneath it, I mean, how on earth, we call them primitive man. They weren't primitive men or women. They were
men or women
obviously
who made
technologically superior to us anyway, in so many ways. But how on earth they managed to get this into place, it looks like a feat of engineering, and to our eye. But perhaps if I read you this little bit from the Dublin Penny Journal, it'll give it some bit more context. The Dublin Penny Journal describes the Cromlech in County Down as Finn's Fingerstone, and that's because if you look at the huge stone on top, it looks a little bit like somebody's left fingerprints in a bit of butter. And it says the top stone measures in length 15 feet and in breadth 10 feet 7 inches. One end now rests on the ground, as we were talking about, but not more than 30 or 40 years ago. So remember, this was written in 1834, so at the end of the 18th century, it was also supported by stones nearly of the same height as those in front. Now the stones in front are a good, off the ground, 6 feet.
6 to 7 feet.
So it may have had stones of an equal size at the back, according to this, which were loosened by persons in search of supposed treasure and afterwards carried away for building. In the memory of several persons now living in the neighbourhood, it was surrounded by stones which formed a circle, a large row of the same running from it in an easterly direction. The article goes on to describe what this used to look like. On the south side and partly under it is a kind of cell formed of 3 stones, and those that support it, 2 being placed on their edges and the third being laid over them, with one end resting on the ground. So that's how it looked in 1834, and it looks pretty much like that now. But it says here, a few years ago, on some persons removing a part of this cell, the opening underneath the big stone, it was found a beautiful urn containing ashes and small bones, which immediately crumbled to dust on being touched and exposed to the air. This urn had beautiful figures cut on it, and likewise a representation of the sun or moon. It also shortly went to pieces. And the writer, who was a Hilltown constabulary officer, says, I have still in my possession a portion of it, and also an arrow of flint that was beside it. A great quantity of bones have been raised here from time to time of a gigantic size, which confirm the inhabitants in the opinion that this cell was the bed of Finn McCool, and that he was buried convenient to the stone. Giant bones, Gavin.
Giant bones. Yeah, this is the first excavation we have here in 1834. And what I find interesting, what was discovered is yes, this extremely ornate cremation urn, but also the flint arrowhead, which, and we have to also say that this site dates from 2500 to 2000 BC. So it's classic megalithic, but we're also talking about the Neolithic peoples who would have used this as well and reused the site as well. That article was actually written before the excavation.
And
so
recalling local folklore about this stone as it was in the 18th century. And that is precious because we don't really have, even on the Sites and Monuments record, you're not going to find that information about what local people were saying. Now, some people will say, well, it was just hearsay, maybe there wasn't a vase and it's nonsense. But this is what we have, and it's in writing, and it's very precious. And for me, it's particularly interesting to see them talking about maybe there being some kind of solar imagery on this urn. That's
the sun
fascinating.
and the moon. That's fascinating. And the idea that they actually had carved human figures. Now that's unusual.
Really fascinating.
Really
That hints
unusual.
at for me, that hints at what were those people doing around the sun and moon. You know, they're on the same urn. And of course, reading in other places about how many of the urns in this area were found, again, by the famous Mr. Isaac Glennie, they were often found upturned. So whether this urn was on its lid with the bones and so on, kept on inside it, that would probably be consistent with everything that the other sites that were mentioned in the O'Donovan.
I was going to say, Anne, it is Goward, one of the sites that the infamous Mr. Glennie dabbled in, because it's around about his...
I'm not entirely sure, but I did bring you something about Mr. Glennie and his work in this area around Hilltown.
Just to put a little bit of context about the excavation process in the 1830s, we're not talking proper archaeological investigation at all. We're really talking about somebody who had the means to effectively, with a cartload of workers,
to bring the right number of people to the place to do the work. And this is
with spade and shovel and pickaxe, and just dig it up, see what you find inside.
And the unfortunate thing for me is learning more about what went on in this part of the world in the 19th century. And it was, to my mind anyway, a bit of an ego, a thing. And when you read about it in this volume of the Dublin Penny Journal, it talks about some of Glennie's excavations in the Hilltown area. And again, it's this constable who's written into the journal to talk about them. It describes him opening a cairn in July 1826, and in it were found a large quantity of calcinated bones, also an urn, tastefully though rudely ornamented, resting on a flag bedded in well-wrought clay. In the urn was a quantity of blackish stuff supposed to be the heart. And then it goes on to say, Mr. Glennie has discovered 10 within 12 months in the aforesaid townland and its vicinity. So we are talking about plunder. Now, I say plunder. Some of that stuff's ended up in museums, but for me, the really difficult part is that we don't know what he found and where he found it, because there's no records.
Yes. A lot of these antiquarians were motivated by altruistic reasons.
I know, and he comes across in O'Donovan's writing about him very affectionately, what a gentleman, what a scholar, what a liberal, and I see that. But 200 years later,
and the vital evidence which we would so dearly love to see
has been lost.
Obviously, this is what I find actually particularly sad about somebody like Glennie, is that his records. Well, first of all, he didn't leave any detailed records of any of the work that he was doing. That doesn't mean to say that he didn't.
No, exactly.
And we were saying this earlier.
Maybe he did keep good records, and we just don't know where they are, what happened to them.
This is it. I mean, it's not like the antiquarians of the 19th and 18th century not to make copious notes, because that's what they did. That was the kind of people they were.
Exactly. But what's so sad is that a lot of his collection after his death was separated, sent off who knows where.
Yes.
And the notes, well, if there were any, we don't know where they are either.
We know this from modern day, where you have somebody who may pass on and die, and their notes or their photographs
don't seem of much importance.
They don't seem of much importance, and they're thrown out of their soul. And I think that possibly happened with Glennie.
But this is the really great lesson, isn't it? That these amazing objects, an urn that could be in the National Museum for all we know, could have ended up there, and we wouldn't know where it came from. And so for people living in this area, they have lost that tangible connection with their local history, and it's sort of become fuzzy over the years, and then that's the sad thing. So keeping notes allows you to keep the connection with the objects, otherwise they're just objects.
Funny enough, you said earlier about an ego trip, and many antiquarians in the 19th century were almost at the cutting edge of what we now would consider to be archaeology.
Yeah.
And they were passionate. There was a passion for cataloguing sites and cataloguing artifacts and coming up with their ideas about what they thought of the world and how to put their society in that world. And Glennie, I think, is probably one of those men who sort of starts, and as we stand here by Goward, you know, he was looking at all these sites in Dolmens, like Knockivey, and trying to think and put them into some kind of context. The problem is we don't have any, as you say, any record of what he was actually. I mean, you were saying about the black stuff and the cremations that he thought were
and that could be analysed, you know, if we had it.
Yes.
So in order to protect things for future generations, you need to be able to think, well, it's not all about me and it's not all about now, it's all about what's going to happen in 200, 500 years' time. And so for me, and I'm willing to be persuaded, but I'd really like to find the notes. I'm currently not a Glennie fan. I would rather see things left alone. But if we're going to, you know, a few drawings, a bit of context for what's happened.
That's the great shame. Is that he didn't leave any of the actual evidence for future historians and archaeologists to actually build on the work that he'd done.
And in terms of the landscape here, which, you know, is a fantastic landscape, in my opinion, understudied. Those were really important notes if we kept them.
Oh, indeed.
So we've lost an awful lot. So I think the truth is we don't know if Glennie was involved in the excavation of Goward or not, because we don't have a record of it.
We don't. And as you say, the sad thing is that a lot of these antiquarians, mostly men, had this vision of what legacy they were going to leave future generations, and unfortunately they've left future generations nothing. Really.
No, and what kind of amuses me, in a sort of slightly black way, is that the monuments that he took apart, Knockivey,
I was going to say ravaged, ransacked, whatever you want to...
still stand.
Yes.
And the monument that he erected to himself and his forefathers is actually gone from the graveyard where he's buried in 200 years. So his monuments didn't last, but the monuments that he took apart actually are still here.
Still
and
here.
I think that says a lot about, I don't know, Victorian...
hubris.
Victorian grave builders,
yes.
for a start, but also, you know, there's a metaphor in there somewhere.
There is, definitely. You look at this wonderful, wonderful dolmen, and you cannot be unimpressed by it because it is so large.
How on earth would they have got it up there? That huge 50-ton stone of granite.
Well, I mean, the idea of it being a communal community exercise of constructing these tombs.
I think we thought we were coming for a quiet spot today, Gavin, but it's really
you know,
not.
I think just in case we keep this bit in, we've got a tractor reversing down a lane on a slope in a field, and a white van with a trailer on it trying to reverse the trailer, and that's going everywhere.
And
two quad bikes and a car.
And I guess, you know, one of the things that shows to me anyway is that in this day and age, it's very easy. It's a very working. The landscape's still being worked, but it's being worked at an incredible rate. And unless this place was scheduled, it may not have survived as well.
That's exactly it. This small little, literally the small corner of this hillside
that has been protected not just by scheduling, but by being taken into state care, has really protected it.
And it still makes me wonder, why did Pat Kearney spend his time here? I mean, did he work?
Why did someone build a house here? Well, yes. I could give you one possible explanation why they built a house here. It was very easy because there was lots of stones around.
Well, yes, and maybe nobody else wanted to live by here.
Indeed. Well, that takes me on very nicely to another little story that I have for you, really.
Professional to the end here.
No, well, I mean, there is local folklore associated with a ghost in this area as well as fairies in this area. So we've got the story of what has become known as the night sower of Goward. And the night sower, I mean, we're talking about the kind of person who was sowing seeds, and back in the old days that wasn't done with a machine. It was done by tying a sheet around your neck and filling the sheet with seeds and then sprinkling them by hand, scattering them by hand. It was a real technique to it, and there's some old video footage actually on RTE showing this being done, so it's really fascinating. So the Goward night sower was someone seen at night who was sowing seed in the fields around here, and scaring the living daylights out of people. And then one day, someone working in a field dug up some bones, and it's believed that the haunting stopped after that, and it was the body of someone who'd been killed, and he was he was appearing so that people could know that he was around.
He was around. So he was seen
Yeah.
scattering seed at night. Oh, you see, around
And I'm
these
sure that
fields.
there's very many other layers to that metaphor. Perhaps it's an older story that goes back to, you know, some sort of fertility or some sort of land. Maybe he was doing something that is beyond my ken, as they say. But yeah, Pat Kearney was living here at a time when that story would have been well known. So I've got another story here again.
The fairy story, is it?
Yeah, it's a nice
Yeah.
wee story, obtained by a local man, Francis McPolin, who was the headmaster of a school in Hilltown, and collected lots of local folklore and stories. And I'll just read directly from this article that I've got. An old lady from Goward assured me that the fairies were decent wee critters, provided you took the right way of them. Years ago, they used to lift things from her house now and again, but she never fell out with them on that account. When she missed any article of her property, say a hatchet, for example, she just tied a piece of woolen thread to the crook before she went to bed for the night and repeated aloud something like this: we people, borrow and lend, and leave back my hatchet as soon as you can. And sure enough, the missing article, whether hatchet or anything else, would turn up again in a very short time. So this belief in the good people, or the good neighbours, or the little people, or whatever you want to call them, or the fairy folk, persisted in Hilltown at the time when Francis McPolin was doing his research into fairies and taking these stories. He said that about a third of the people would admit to believing in fairies, but he thought that the true number was much higher, because people wouldn't admit to it. And again, you know, that people still will leave a fairy tree alone in a field.
Oh, absolutely. And funny enough, noticing the picture, we have the first picture you showed me, which basically shows how open
the
landscape
here,
is.
was.
You would certainly know. I mean, obviously, this field boundary is still
It's still the same
field boundary,
but it's way more overgrown now than it was. Which is lovely, actually, in some senses, in this world where, you know, nature is vanishing. It's an interesting contrast.
I know, and funny enough, like when we first came into this, and you were calling it like a dell, and it's funny. It is like a little kind of calm spot here, an enclave. But it didn't look like this. If we walk up to the top of the little kind of hill bit here, which is right by the back end of the dolmen, and by the field boundary itself, you can see a bit of the reused stones that have obviously just chucked some of them, gone into the wall.
And they may have been used in Pat's house as well.
They may have been used in Pat's house, absolutely. And I would sort of suggest that the field boundary is going to be a 19th century field boundary.
Yeah. Whenever Glennie was working in the area, he opened up lots of hilltop cairns, and there's certainly a couple at very close quarters, very nearby, as well as Knockivy. And so we have a landscape here with a whole lot of megaliths in it.
Well, that's right. I mean, so as we're standing here in Goward, the other two kind of like some almost contemporary and parallel dolmens are Leganani and Ballykeel. And there's there's lots of dolmens in County Down. So, you know, there's Dundrum. And there's, and as far as like monuments go around here.
We have lots. But what kind of frustrates me is the relationships between those monuments perhaps haven't been studied as fully as in other places. And I know there has been some really good work done around the Mourns, you know, and certainly down south in Ireland to do with
some beautiful sites there.
There's some beautiful sites, and there's been some landscape archaeology done just looking at how they might interrelate, which have taken in Goward as well, but unfortunately not stretched any further towards Rathfriland.
Which is like sort of the Cashel, which isn't very far away from here. Is that
Dromina Castle?
Dromina.
Oh, it's quite a stunning place.
It
if you
is.
haven't been, get out in the car and go and visit.
We
Dromina
should go
Castle.
there one time. Actually, definitely we should go
Come
there.
back to the little souterrain in there as
Dromina.
well.
It's a beautiful, beautiful site. But that's not it's not a million miles away from here either.
Not at all.
And the interaction of all of these locations in the landscape, I think, is
always really interesting. What can you see, and how what you see every day changes you and changes your behaviour. So where the sun rises through the year changes the way that people live in their houses. We still build our houses to face the south.
Isn't that the interesting thing? Because obviously when this was open, and when the McGuinness were building the castle at Rathfriland, it's all interconnected.
Goward, thankfully, is safe, but there's there's a number of other sites that just aren't currently. You can really imagine why they might associate this particular dolmen with Finn, because the size is so. It's so huge.
I mean, it's a giant stone. And there's no doubt
Yeah.
about it. So it's got
I love
to
the
be.
bit about the giant bones, though.
Yeah.
What's that all about? Where did they? What, giant bones? Are we digging up?
Well, giant
Fomorians here.
Well, I was going to say giant bones to a person in the 1830s
Indeed.
could be our height.
A nice big tall. Or, as we know that many of the great leaders were selected because of their physical attributes. So maybe they were digging up a giant.
I'll tell you this, Anne, there has been an awful lot of DNA work done recently on giantism in Ireland, and the fact that there has been cases, and that can be explained, the whole point of people who are actual termed giants, because they are 8 feet.
Well, yes, but
7 to 8 feet
those guys,
tall.
I mean, the taller you get, the sort of weaker you get in some ways as well.
That's exactly it, Anne. They have had very difficult lives because their bone structure isn't maybe as dense. They are brittle, but they are giant.
Yeah.
And you kind of think of it, if you are a 5 foot person or under 5 foot,
and you find a big femur.
you're going to say this is a huge.
But maybe,
this is going to be Finn McCool,
as they were suggesting in the 19th century, that these were the graves of great chieftains or great leaders. Maybe they were fine physical specimens as well. Maybe they were bigger than your average Joe, and that's why they were finding these large bones.
Yes, and depositing them somewhere different to everybody else.
Yeah. But of course we don't really know what was found here, except I love the urn. I love that it had the solar or lunar imagery on it, and little people, as you say.
I was going to say little people on an urn, and I have to admit it's the flint arrowhead every time.
Oh, is it? That's
obviously the flint arrowhead every time.
Mine is the old sort of the old pagans dancing around the sun and the moon. I kind of tickles my fancy.
Because every weekend.
Calvin, don't be telling everybody that.
But I think we'll bid a fond farewell to Goward. Thank you, Mr. Kearney.
Until the next time.
Until the next time.
Yes, and as you say, Mr. Kearney, who knows, maybe he's still looking after it.
I think he possibly is. And I'd like to think that there was something maybe a wee bit more to that.
A relationship with a place, a steward.
You couldn't look out your window and be 15 feet away from a dolmen and not have some kind of affinity with it.
A man after my own heart. Well, Gavin, it'd be very tempting to stay here all day, but we better hit the road.
I think we should, Anne.
Okay, let's do it.
Right, Anne. Where are we now?
Well, blimey. We are.
I'm leaving you to describe this.
It's so beautiful where we are right now. I say we've come to South Armagh.
Yes, we're kind of on the cusp of both Armagh and Down, but pretty much on the Armagh side of the Ring of Gullion.
Yeah, it's just absolutely stunning. I mean, we're really standing in the middle of Gullion's Ring. We've got Slieve Gullion behind us, and I'm looking up, and I can see, well, one of the two cairns, and I can imagine that lovely lake in the middle. And I can imagine myself stopping 3 or 4 times on the way up,
yes.
up the hill as well. But beautiful day to climb Slieve Gullion. But we haven't come to climb Slieve Gullion or to go for a walk in the Ring of Gullion, which would also be amazing. But we're here at another little country road.
Another little country road.
Another little field.
Another little field. And actually, Anne,
I'm going
to take you down the road here. Because as we walk down this little country lane, I say country lane, it is a main road. And we've got the mountains all around us.
Absolutely gorgeous. And the Ring of Gullion isn't really like, it's not like any other hills in the area. They look very different. They're more gnarly. They're more kind of, there's lots more shadows on them. They don't look like, they're little
tiny mountains.
It's like a big mountain range, but on a mini scale.
Absolutely. And all the colours of the green and the brown and the heather, and it's just sort of, and the sun.
It is beautiful.
All the granite up.
I tell you what, though, there's plenty of blackberries, and there's a sloe. It's my first sloe of the year. Probably nowhere near ready for my gin, but we've got a nice sloe bush here. So yes, everything is looking very bountiful here in the middle of the Ring of Gullion.
I have to admit, whenever you come down, there's this little road. It's all, I mean, even if you had like a camera and you were like, you couldn't take it all in. There's too much to take in.
Totally, you have to focus on the small things. But no, it's absolutely. I mean, even the hedgerows here are very different to where I live. Actually, they're much more mixed, and they're much more. They seem a little bit further on.
And
so
there's a little stile.
Stile here.
And I'll just, there we go over there.
Which is really nice. keep
And
the
of course-
animals in and the people can climb over it.
Yes.
And then another state monument sign.
Ballykeel, Dolmen and Kent have been here actually more recently than I have.
Well, I have
Because-
never been here before, Gavin.
Oh,
That's the squeak of a gate.
Squeaky gate.
It's not even squeaky gate music, it's a real squeaky
I
gate.
know,
Oh,
real
look what they've left behind in this lovely little enclosure. We've got a perfect little fairy tree right beside the dolmen. Isn't that lovely?
Exactly.
And so we're kind of in a rectangular enclosure, like modern enclosure with the fence around it. But there's a lot of stones, big stones kind of on our way up to this dolmen, which is just gorgeous. She's lovely.
It is fantastic.
And she is lovely, because that's definitely a she. Compared to where we've just been,
yes,
where he was big and strong and massive, she is much more
delicate.
elegant. Yeah.
And the whole site here at Ballykeel, you have the dolmen, you have the round cairn, and effectively you have the passage tomb, which is, I mean, often neglected, to be quite honest, Anne.
Well, there's an interesting little wall still here to the side of the dolmen. It's very straight looking, of small stones and a depression beside it.
This is all part of the portal and the passage tomb.
So where you're standing was
where
the
I'm
passage.
standing.
Fabulous.
And all of this will be covered, of course, with earth. But we can go inside.
This is lovely.
Well,
It does remind me of Leganani Dolmen
It's exact. This is
a little bit, doesn't it? Because it's sort of poised in that. I mean, if you look at the back, we've got, so just to give you a description of what we're looking at, so the capstone of this is nothing like as big as what we have at Goward, but 8 feet long
About
and maybe
8
a
to
foot
10
in
feet
depth.
long, about
What do you say, 10 feet long?
10 feet long. And the interesting thing is, come in here,
Mm-hmm.
you can actually see the cut mark. But the thing is, you see these these actual carvings in the uprights. And those you can think, well, that's quite interesting.
It's absolutely fascinating. And what reminds me of Leganani is the way that these taper to a point, the two big stones at the back. So we've got this large flat stone on top that we've just described, and it is really remarkably flat with some circular sort of depressions in it. And it's leaning on 3 big stones, the smallest of which is at the front.
Yes.
And then these 2 larger ones at the
Two
back. And I
large
guess
ones at
they're
the
about
back.
5 to 6, 5.5 foot, 6 foot tall.
Yes,
the stones at
with
the
a
back.
smaller-
From what we can see.
Yeah, with a smaller stone, which has got a flat surface to it. At Goward, the top stone is right down to the ground.
Yes, it meets the ground.
meets
And
the ground.
of course, it didn't always meet the ground.
No,
They said
it would have
didn't-
looked like
more like
this.
this. It would have been raised up.
And I brought you here because Dolmen's actually also known as the witch's or hag's chair. And if you notice, and you did notice, there is a fairy thorn.
Aye, there's an old fairy tree, and it is an old one because there's only half of it left, half of it's
Yes.
fallen down. Okay, so
Looking
what
at
was it
different
like,
phases.
do you think, when it was originally put here?
Well, it would have been a mound with a chamber due to come into. And it might have even mirrored some of the mounds of the landscape here as well. These shapes in the skyline, I think, probably would have echoed what we saw
So
here.
it was built kind of specifically to integrate with the landscape.
I think
where it was put.
sympathetic with the landscape. And also so that it could be part of the landscape, but also if you think about it, you're surrounded here, again, by the mountains and, as you pointed out, other landmarks all around us as well. I
And
think
right
it's all part-
beside the beautiful Slave Gullion, which of course has its own Cailleach association. So the hag, the Irish for hag is Cailleach, and so we've got the Cailleach's cave or the Cailleach's house on Slave Gullion, and now we've got the Cailleach's chair linking in with that whole Cailleach mythology of this part of Armagh.
But I do find it fascinating that this actual site is so well preserved, and yet very few people know about
Come here.
Ballykeel.
It's odd because, for example, Leganani Dolmen, which everybody knows so well, actually there's a cairn above it.
Yes.
And it's very hard to pick out now, but it's possible to go and have a look at it. It's not very big.
Yes.
And so I just wondered, does this dolmen relate to the cairn above it, and is that how come they both have the same kind of Cailleach hag associations? So it's located lower in the
Lower down,
landscape.
I think you're probably right, because I think all of these particular monuments have a sort of continuity of themselves. They're all linked to each other.
So whereas you can see the cairns from miles around, and they're
Yes.
very much focal points in the landscape, these are more tucked away, in between the rolling hills.
Almost like, again, we've said this a few times, almost like it's there, but you don't really want to talk about it.
I know it is tucked away, and I mean whether or not it was always tucked away is another story, and obviously, but there's no way these landmarks, these monuments weren't in some way connected to one another. Certainly in the folklore,
Absolutely.
but also in reality.
And I think in reality, in practice, I think that's they're designed to be here and to be visited. And we can see
Isn't it
from
lovely
the
that it's still
ribbons,
being visited?
Yes, of the ribbons on the fairy
So
thorn
if we just
here.
if we go and have a look at this tree,
Actually,
which is just
it's still
coming into
being
berries,
visited.
and half of it's broken off probably in the wind. I doubt anybody would have done that deliberately, and plenty of people have come and tied ribbons to the tree with little bells on, I see, as well. And the bells, it's interesting, we were actually discussing a Goward sound, and we talked about how that was the resound of the high voice or something along those lines, and what that might mean. As on the way here, we were discussing, wonder whether there's any bell associations with the cows going up to Billy or whatever. What might the sound have been? And we come here and we've got lovely bells tied to the tree.
Isn't that interesting?
It's nice. So we were resounding in a different way down here, in a more tinkly kind of way. The Cailleach's chair, what's the relationship between the Cailleach and Goward, where we've just come from? Finn's Fingerstone. It's tempting, isn't it?
It is very, very tempting.
It's tempting to make the analogy between Finn and the Cailleach, the king and the land goddess.
And the land goddess, the witch and the hag, the old lady tempting the young king.
Shocking.
Shocking.
And that's an eternal sort of archetype throughout the island, really, is of the sort of land goddess or Cailleach, or the sort of witch figure, the wizened hag.
Yes, with a lot of money.
Tempting. Yes, well, either a lot of money or a lot of wealth of some kind.
Wealth kind of
and I
power.
suppose,
That's it, isn't it? Power.
The ability to bestow
yes.
wealth and power onto the right kind of man. And the right kind of man was a young man who wasn't repulsed by her.
Yes,
who was up for it.
But who was attracted by her wealth or something else. Or saw beyond. We all like to think, saw into her soul.
It makes me think of a quite a well-known Irish song, actually, called "The Hag with the Money," and the words of that song are yeah, it's a song about.
There's something very attractive about that.
A hag with money. I know. No, the rich widow. Yeah. The words of the song translate something like, "She's your granny, the hag with the money," and the song's all about, a young man who will he marry this old woman, and the shock that people are imagining that he would entertain the idea of going with this old hag, and so it's quite a well-known song called Cailleach an Urgid, and I hope I've pronounced that right. And I've got a lovely recording of it by a lady called Niamh na Cara from Dublin, and she released an album in 2010 where she covers this song, and her album's called Happy Out, and it's a lovely fresh version of a song that I first heard 20 years ago, and I hope you enjoy it. Have a listen.
She Cailleach an Urgid. She do a moi o waller is rory's car. She goes to your water goes out again. Mustn't to go, mustn't to go, Cailleach an Urgid. Toss on the boss, I thought she wrote up, it does in the wreck, his dog sent out again. She do a moi, she Cailleach an Urgid. She do a moi no waller is rory's car. She goes to your water goes out again. She do a moi, she Cailleach an Urgid. She do a moi no waller is rory's car. She goes to your water goes out again. Scargabos, partner of my shaw. Scargabos, Shawnee me or a Marvin, you gotta say. She do a moi, she Cailleach an Urgid. She do a more no one in the stories. She goes to your own course again.
Well, Gavin, what did you make of that?
Oh, well, it's instantly familiar, and
Right.
that's the thing. I'm pretty sure I've heard that before, either Altan, Capacele, Clanad. It's a very familiar tune
It's
to me.
very repetitive,
It
this
is.
refrain, She's Your Granny.
But it gets into your head, of course. That's the
Uh-huh,
other thing, 'cause
uh-huh.
it's so traditional as well.
And I don't know how far back that tune comes from, but it sort of has the feeling that it might be something that everybody could sing along to, and repeat and repeat and repeat.
By
And
a fireside somewhere,
Uh-huh.
that's probably, an intuitive kind of like
Yeah.
rhythm to it as well. So
and
it's-
obviously the baron underneath that rhythmical sort of pulse, the way
Yeah.
she's recorded it there. So I really enjoyed that. I thought it was quite a fresh take on the song, but there's many, many others, as you say. And what I like about it is that if the translation's correct, and it is She's Your Granny, the hag with the money, it's nearly like she's everybody's granny. And is that song actually about that ritual of kingship where the
Yes.
king would have been ritually married to the land, and then another king, and then another king, and then another king, and the land
And
goddess
so on
stays the
and so
same,
forth,
and he
yes.
is renewed. So this old lady with the younger man,
Yeah.
the hag with the sort of young
But
lover.
she'll also be timeless. That's the whole
Mm.
thing, isn't it? That she may be ancient but timeless, and the kings come and go,
Mm-hmm.
and
So I don't know how old that song is, and whether it was intended to sort of invoke that. Maybe it was. I kind of like to think that it was. And certainly I read an article recently that suggested that that might be where that song had originated. So thank you very much to Niamh for letting us use that song
Oh,
on today's
absolutely.
podcast. And go out and buy her album called, it's called Happy Out in English.
Happy
I wouldn't
Out.
even dream of trying to pronounce it in Irish because I'd get it wrong. But it was very kind of her to let us use that lovely fresh recording.
was.
You can get it on Spotify, and you can get it, and you can find her on YouTube as well. So thank you, Niamh. I've always been fascinated by the word portal. These are
portal tombs.
portal tombs, and portal means door.
Yes.
So I kind of wonder, is this the doorway? Do you come and knock at the door before you ascend up the hill, or whatever it is? I'm not sure what the relationship
Well,
is, but it's
this is
tempting
it.
to think there
It
is
is
one.
tempting to think. It is knocking at the door of something.
What can you see when you visit a dolmen? Look up and
Yes.
see.
Look up. As ever, always look up.
Always look up. And I think that's a great note. So hopefully we'll tempt some people down into South Down and South Armagh
South
to
Armagh,
have a visit to,
open
these dolmens.
the squeaky gate.
Maybe that's the portal. Bring your sandwiches and your pot of tea, but leave no trace.
Leave no trace, always be tidy, and close the gate after you.
Marvellous. And on that note, I think we'll hit the road again. Thanks again for a lovely day.
Thank you, Anne, for
And
coming
if you
on.
enjoyed today's podcast, don't forget you can subscribe to get updates about the next podcast. And we're going to be back in October with a special Halloween spooky podcast. And we're really looking forward to that
spooky
one.
cast.
So yes, stay tuned, and we'll see you again very soon. Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you, Anne.
If you enjoyed the Homespun History podcast, don't forget to subscribe to receive alerts as new episodes become available. And you can follow Homespun History on Twitter @Homespun History. Thanks for listening.